signal lasted 4 seconds. That was the problem. Not that it came from the wrong direction. Not that it arrived on a frequency the Conclave had declared impossible, but that it lasted 4 seconds. And then it stopped. And then the Conclave's most senior resonance analyst, a being called Veth Incursion, who had survived 11 wars and 17 planetary extinctions, said one word in a voice that had never trembled before. Again. It came again. For seconds. Stopped. "What is that?" said Commander Sela Idris, the only human in the room, which was not unusual. She was often the only human in rooms. She had made a career of it. "The frequency," Veth Incursion said slowly, its membranes cycling through colors that the translation system was struggling to process, corresponds to a species pattern we archived 43 years ago. Idris felt the cold move through her before the words did. Which species? The room went the kind of quiet that only happens when everyone already knows the answer and no one wants to be the one to confirm it. Then the signal came a third time. And this time it was not 4 seconds. This time it kept going. 43 years ago, the Conclave had declared humanity extinct. It had not been a declaration made lightly. The Conclave did not make decisions lightly. This was a coalition of 41 species, organized across 9 star systems, governed by a consensus model so complex that it took a species roughly 2 centuries to fully understand all the ways they could be overruled. But the humans had been a problem the Conclave had eventually stopped having, which was different from a problem being solved, and after enough time, they had filed the paperwork. Species designation, Homo sapiens sapiens. Status, extinct. Date of last confirmed contact, cycle 4420.11. Cause, multifactorial collapse, accelerated by Veth Incursion pressure and internal cascading failures. The paperwork was very thorough. Idris had read it once. She had read it in a tiny room on a station so far from Earth's coordinates that the distance was essentially a philosophical concept, and she had not cried, because she had been raised by people who had been raised by people who had been raised to be the kind of people who could look at a piece of paper that said your species was dead and not cry in public. She had filed her own counter-report immediately after. The counter-report was 11 pages long. It was also very thorough. No one in the Conclave had responded to it. That was 3 years ago. The signal resolved into language on the 4th minute, not the kind of resolution that happened gradually. The way translation usually worked, the Conclave systems building models and refining probabilities and proposing candidates. This was immediate, blunt. The message arrived in 17 languages simultaneously, and one of them was Conclave Standard, and the first line of it was, "Hello. Sorry we're late." Idris read it twice. Then she said very quietly, "I need everyone out of this room." "Commander," Veth Incursion began, "I need everyone out of this room, and I need a direct channel lock to this signal, and I need it done in the next 30 seconds. There was a moment. The Conclave was not accustomed to being spoken to that way. Idris had been making a 43-year project of teaching it. The room emptied. The channel locked. She sat down. She looked at the transmission header. She looked at the source coordinates. She thought, for a very long time, about what the source coordinates meant. Then she pressed open the channel and said, "This is Commander Sela Idris, Conclave Diplomatic Liaison, speaking on an unsecured frequency. I am required by treaty to inform you that this channel may be monitored. I'm ignoring that requirement. Who is this?" Static. And then, "Commander Idris." The voice was human. It sounded like someone who hadn't spoken in a very long time and was remembering how while doing it. "We know who you are. You filed the counter-report." "I did. We've been watching you file things for 3 years." A pause. "Thank you." Idris closed her eyes. "Open them. The Conclave declared you extinct." "The Conclave," said the voice, "declares a lot of things. We've noticed." "Are there survivors? How many survivors? What are your coordinates?" "Commander." The voice was gentle. "We have a lot to talk about, but first we need to know if you can keep a secret." She laughed once, a short, sharp sound that surprised even her. "From the Conclave? I've been keeping secrets from the Conclave Since before you were born. Who am I talking to? Another pause. Longer. And when the voice came back it was different, not in tone, but in weight. It sounded like someone who was about to say something they'd been saving for a very long time. My name is Yusuf Adisa. I'm the coordinator of the new Meridian Compact. We are not extinct, Commander Idris. We are not even close to extinct. A breath. We have a problem, though. What kind of problem? The Veth kind. The Veth Incursion had ended the old world. That was how everyone talked about it. Not as a war, because wars had fronts and strategies and surrender negotiations. The Veth had not been interested in any of those things. The Veth were distributed intelligence, 60% biological and 40% something that the Conclave's philosophers were still arguing about, and they consumed. Systems, resources, information. What they wanted from humanity was not humanity. It was what humanity had built, and once they'd stripped the infrastructure, the planet had been a liability they'd simply stopped servicing. The Conclave's response had been, Idris thought, very conclave. 41 species spent 2 decades discussing the appropriate multilateral approach to the Veth question while Earth went dark. By the time the Conclave had issued a formal condemnation, humanity had lost 3/4 of its population and all of its outer installations. By the time the Conclave had proposed a sanctions framework, the remaining quarter had scattered. The Conclave had been very sorry about this. They had a resolution. 43 years later, the resolution was still in committee. How many? Idris said. Compact-wide. Adisa's voice was calm, factual, like someone reading off a ledger. 31,000. Spread across 6 installations. We've been dark for 40 years. 31,000. She repeated it. Out of 8 billion. Yes, the silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. And the Veth, she said finally. Still in our system. We think they're finishing the extraction. A pause. We're running out of time to act. Act how? 31,000 people can't. We're not 31,000 people, Adisa said. Something in his voice had changed. Something that she would spend the next 3 days trying to categorize and eventually just call certainty. We're 31,000 people who've had 40 years to prepare. Prepare for what? To do what the Conclave couldn't. She sat with that for a moment. You're going to need to be more specific. Commander Idris, Adisa said. We've been running simulations for 38 years. We know the Veth. Not like the Conclave knows them. The Conclave knows their documentation, their patterns, their historical data. We know how they think. And we found something. Another pause. And this one was different from the others, shorter, like he was bracing himself. A flaw. In the Veth. In their model of us. Yusuf Adisa was 54 years old. He had been born on New Meridian, the largest of the 6 compact installations, which occupied a space so deeply folded into a brown dwarf's electromagnetic shadow that the Conclave sensors had never thought to look there. He had grown up in a city built inside a mountain, lit by solar relays, fed by hydroponic stacks 40 levels deep, governed by a council of survivors who had carried their professional titles all the way into exile because it turned out that even at the end of the world, people needed to feel like the thing they'd built their life around still meant something. His mother had been an economist. His father had been a structural engineer. His grandmother, who had died 2 years before he was born, had reportedly been absolutely furious about the whole situation right up until the end, which was apparently a family trait. He had never seen Earth. He had seen it in recordings. He had spent large portions of his childhood memorizing its geography the way other children memorize mythology, not as a place he could visit, but as a story about where he had come from. He had started running simulations at 16. By 20 he had a basic model. By 35 the model was predictive to within 4%. By 48 it had a solution. He'd spent the next 6 years making sure it was real before he'd allowed anyone to tell anyone else about it. Show me, Idris said. He showed her. It took 11 hours. She asked questions throughout, and her questions were good. Adisa had been briefing people for 2 years, and he could always tell in the first 5 minutes whether someone was going to be useful. Idris was not just useful. Idris was the specific kind of useful that only exists in people who have been alone in a fight for a long time and have learned to love the loneliness, because it means they're still fighting. The flaw in the Veth model was this. The Veth were a distributed intelligence. Distributed intelligences operated on consensus, not ideological consensus, not political consensus, but mathematical consensus. Every unit contributed to a shared calculation, and the calculation determined behavior. This was extremely efficient. This was also, Adisa had spent 38 years determining, a critical vulnerability, because distributed consensus required a shared model of reality, and the Veth's shared model of humanity was 43 years out of date. They believed humanity was extinct. More precisely, they had calculated humanity into their model as a resolved variable. Zero threat, zero resource. Not worth the processing overhead of ongoing assessment. The files were closed. So, Idris said slowly, they're not watching. They stopped watching, Adisa said, approximately 37 years ago. Our best estimate is that they've been running on a passive maintenance protocol for the last decade, finishing the extraction, which takes time, but not urgently. And if they're not watching, they can't account for what we've built. She looked at the schematics. She had been looking at them for 3 hours. Adisa, I'm a diplomat. I understand strategy at the conceptual level. But these, she gestured at the screen, which he couldn't see. But he understood the gesture from her tone. This requires a military operation I don't have the authority to sanction. We're not asking the Conclave to sanction it, Adisa said. Then what are you asking? We're asking you, he said simply, to look the other way. The silence was so long that he started to wonder if the connection had dropped. Commander Idris? I'm here, she said. I'm thinking. Take your time. I don't have time. Neither do you. Her voice changed, the slight softening at the edges hardening back to the thing she'd trained herself to keep constant. If I look the other way, and your operation fails, the Veth will know you exist. They will update their model. 31,000 people. Yes, and if I look the other way and your operation succeeds, then the Conclave will have a lot of explaining to do, Adisa said, and humanity will handle the rest. Another long silence. What does handle the rest mean? She said. Adisa exhaled. It means we've been building for 40 years, not just the operation. We've been building infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, food security, knowledge transfer systems. We have 17 complete technical libraries. We have 3 independently operational shipyards. We have... Pause. We have more people than 31,000, Commander. Her breath caught. What? 31,000 is the compact number. People who registered, who are accounted for, who we know about. A pause that she would later describe, in her private journal, as the most precisely calibrated silence she had ever heard. We've been finding others for 40 years. Quietly, in the places the Veth didn't look, which turns out to be most of the outer systems, because the Veth are very thorough, but they're not curious. They don't check. They resolve and move on. His voice was quiet now, careful. Our best estimate, which I want to be clear is an estimate with large error bars, is between 4 and 6 million. Idris stood up. She stood up because she couldn't stay sitting, and she walked to the far wall of the room, and she put her hand against the cold alloy surface, and she breathed, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when she was 7 years old on a station in the Kuiper Belt, on a day when the heating had failed, and they'd all had to share one emergency thermal, and her mother had said, breathe slowly, Sela. Slow breathing uses less heat. 4 to 6 million, she said. Yes, you've been hiding 4 to 6 million people. We've been protecting 4 to 6 million people, Adisa said, for 40 years, while the Conclave filed its reports. She said nothing. The wall was cold against her palm. Commander Idris. His voice was very gentle now. We never stopped. We just went quiet, and the Veth saw quiet and assumed dead, because that's what their model said. A pause. Their model is wrong. She turned around. looked at the room, looked at the screens, still showing the schematics, the projections, the 40-year plan laid out in clean lines and columns and numbers that had been carried in someone's head for 3 decades before they dared to write them down. The Conclave, she said slowly, is going to lose its collective mind. We know. Some of them are going to be angry about this. We know. Not angry the way you might be angry. Angry the way something very old and very organized gets angry when it realizes it's been operating on wrong information for 4 decades. There will be committees. There will be investigations. There will be. Commander, a hint of something in his voice. Not quite humor. Something adjacent to humor. The way a fire is adjacent to the fuel it's been waiting for. We've been listening to the Conclave for 40 years. We know about the committees. She laughed. She didn't mean to, and it came out half a sob and half a laugh, and entirely real. Okay, she said. Okay, tell me what you need. We need 11 days. 11 days. 11 days and one thing. What thing? The Veth distribute their consensus signal through 14 relay nodes, Adisa said. 13 we can handle ourselves. The 14th is in Conclave space. We need someone who can access it and make sure it doesn't transmit an alert during the operation window. The silence now was a different kind. Thinking silence. Calculating silence. The silence of a woman who had spent 15 years learning the precise architecture of every system she operated inside for exactly this kind of moment. That's not looking the other way, she said. No, he admitted. It isn't. That's active interference with Conclave infrastructure in a way that could end my career and possibly result in criminal charges. Yes, Adisa. Commander, I haven't seen Earth, she said. I was born after. My mother described it to me, but I've never. She stopped. That's not relevant. It might be. What I'm saying is that I've built my entire career around not being the kind of person who takes unilateral action. Everything I've done has been through channels. Proper channels. Documented channels. I have 11 years of documented channels. I know, Adisa said. I've read them all. She pressed her lips together. And, he said, I think you've known since you filed the counter-report that the channels weren't going to work. She said nothing. I think you filed the report because it was the right thing to do. Not because you thought anyone was going to act on it. A pause. I think you've been waiting for something to act on instead. The silence stretched. You are very sure of yourself, she said. I've had 38 years of simulations, he said. You were in all of them. She blinked. I was. She paused. I'm in your models. You're in our models. You've been in our models since you filed the counter-report. We've been watching you the same way we've been watching the Veth. He paused. You're better than the Veth. In simulations. In the simulations. She thought about this. She thought about the cold wall and her mother's voice and the 11 pages of a counter-report that no one had answered. She thought about the 43 years between the paperwork and the signal. She thought about 4 to 6 million people living quietly in the outer dark, in places the Veth hadn't checked, because their models said there was nothing to check. What's the confidence level? She said finally. On the operation? 87%, Adisa said. Without the relay node, 61. And at 61% if it fails. 31,000 people, he said quietly. Or rather, everything we've built. All of it. They'll update their model and they'll sweep the whole region. Including the 4 to 6 million they don't know about. Yes, 87%. 13% failure. 4 to 6 million people. I need 36 hours to access the relay, she said. We know. We've already factored it in. Of course you have. She took a breath. I need one more thing. Name it. When this is over, she said. I need a recording. Something I can play for the Conclave. Something that explains what happened and why we were right to do it. We can do that. Something, she said carefully, that they won't be able to argue with. That makes it absolutely unambiguous, because the Conclave is going to want someone to blame, and it's going to be me. and I need to be able to stand in front of 41 species and explain why a decision made by one human to help 4 to 6 million humans is not a human problem. It is their failure, their documentation, their committees, their resolution that has been in committee for 43 years while people... She stopped herself. I need a record. Commander Idris, Adisa said. We've been keeping records since day one. How thorough? 11 generations thorough, he said. Every meal, every birth, every repair, every adaptation, every system we built from nothing in a brown dwarf shadow because the alternative was accepting that we were supposed to be dead. A pause. You'll have everything. She closed her eyes. Opened them. Okay, she said. Yusuf. A brief, surprised pause. She'd used his name. First name. The thing that meant they were past the formal architecture of things. Sela, he said, matching her. We're going to get in a lot of trouble. Possibly, he said. Or, he said carefully. We're going to do the thing that the Conclave couldn't do. And then we're going to stand in front of 41 species with 4 to 6 million people behind us. And no one is going to be in a position to argue about committee jurisdictions. She was quiet for a moment, and then, for the second time in an hour, she laughed. But this one was different. This one didn't have a sob in it at all. Start the clock, she said. 11 days. The relay node was called Station Yethkari. It had been built by the Conclave's third oldest member species, a sessile silicon-based culture called the Kari, who communicated through pressure waves and had been part of the Conclave for so long that most of the coalition's founding infrastructure still bore their architectural signature. Gentle curves, dense materials, an aesthetic that could best be described as patient. Idris had visited Station Yethkari 4 times. She knew its layout. She knew its staff rotation. She knew that the Veth relay maintenance system ran on a 67-hour cycle, and that during the transition between cycle segments, a window of approximately 4 hours, the system ran a self-diagnostic that reduced its external sensitivity to roughly 30% of normal. She had known this for 2 years. She had written it in a document marked for her eyes only, and then written a second document about why noting it was irrelevant to her duties, and filed them both in the same folder, and then tried not to think about the folder. She thought about the folder now. She requisitioned a maintenance inspection of the station's secondary communications infrastructure, a routine enough request from a senior Conclave liaison, and she took a shuttle, alone, and she sat in the shuttle for 4 hours while it traveled, and she ate a ration bar she'd been carrying in her bag for 3 weeks and thought about her mother. Her mother had been a navigation systems engineer. She had spent her career building routes through space that other people used to get where they were going. She had never talked much about the route itself, only the destination, only the point where you stopped and looked around and said, "There, we're there." Idris thought, "Where are we going?" And then she thought, "We're going back." The diagnostic window was everything Adisa's models had predicted. The relay node's Veth integration system dropped to 31% sensitivity, not 30, but close enough. Idris moved through the station with a speed and efficiency that came from years of learning exactly how fast you could move in a Conclave installation without alarming anyone, which was faster than most species expected. She had 12 minutes. She used 11. On the way back to the shuttle dock, she passed a Kari communications technician, a 6-legged being the color of weathered granite, moving with the particular slowness of a species that measured time in geological strata, and it made the gesture that meant acknowledgement of shared space, and she made it back, and it continued on its way, and she continued on hers, and the relay node continued its self-diagnostic, and somewhere in the outer dark, a countdown reached 0. She watched it from the shuttle, not the operation itself. She had no access to the operation itself. She watched the signals. She watched the Veth relay pattern, which was like watching a heartbeat for something you weren't sure was alive. She watched the fluctuations that meant the consensus system was operating normally. And then she watched the moment, at 17 hours into the 11-day window, when the pattern changed. Not dramatically. Not the way it would look in a story. There was no explosion of signals, no cascade of alerts. The pattern simply shifted. Slightly. The way a machine sounds different when something inside it is no longer connected to the network it thinks it's part of. She had to look at it for 40 seconds before she was certain. Then she said, very quietly, to no one, "There you go." The Veth didn't respond immediately. This was the part of the operation that Adisa had spent the most time modeling, and the part he'd slept the least over, because the Veth's consensus architecture meant that when one part of the system encountered anomalous data, the entire distributed intelligence began the process of reconciliation, checking the model against observed reality. The question was how long that process took. How long before the model updated? How long before 31,000 people became not 31,000 but 4 to 6 million, visible and known, and very much not extinct? The answer was 3 days. They had 3 days. They used 2. Idris received the confirmation at 0400 station time, which was not a time she was normally awake, but she had not been sleeping. She was sitting in her quarters with a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at the wall when the signal came through. One word. Done. She put down the cup of tea. She sat there for a while longer. Then she stood up and went to her console and began composing the message she had been drafting in her head for 43 years. Not to the Compact, to the Conclave. It started. To the Assembly in full session. This message constitutes formal notification of a significant revision to species classification record #4420-11, Homo sapiens sapiens, status, extinct. The classification was an error. I am enclosing 11 generations of documentation. Attached separately, a full account of the Veth system incursion response, conducted by surviving human populations over a period of 43 years, without conclave awareness or support. This account has been prepared by the new Meridian Compact and is presented as the complete and factual record of the relevant period, the Conclave's Resolution 7840. On the matter of the Veth Incursion and the question of human territories, which has been in committee for 43 years, may be considered resolved. I will be available for inquiry at the Assembly's convenience. Respectfully submitted, Commander Sela Idris, Diplomatic Liaison. She read it twice. Then she added one line at the end. P.S. They did it themselves. She sent it. The Conclave's reaction took 3 weeks to fully develop, which was, Idris reflected, actually quite fast for the Conclave. There were committee sessions. There were emergency committee sessions. There were inquiries into her conduct, which she answered completely and without apology, because she had made a decision and she was not interested in pretending she hadn't. There were inquiries into the Compact's conduct, which the Compact answered with 11 generations of documentation, which took the inquiry committee 4 months to read even partially, during which time 4 to 6 million people who had been living quietly in the outer dark continued to live quietly in the outer dark. The Veth's response was more interesting. The operation had not destroyed the Veth's presence in the old Sol system. That had never been the goal. The goal had been to interrupt their consensus relay system at a precise point in the extraction cycle, creating a cascading recalculation in their distributed intelligence that forced them to spend resources on internal reconciliation rather than external processing. In effect, making them look inward for long enough to complete a specific set of objectives. Those objectives were not military. They were not weapons or fortifications or strategic strikes. They were, in fact, something that took the Conclave's Military Assessment Committee another 6 months to categorize. Adisa explained it to Idris in a call 2 weeks after the confirmation. We moved people, he said, all the people we could find in the most resource-rich areas of the old system, to locations the Veth had already resolved as depleted, which they are. But the Veth's model of depleted resources doesn't account for what humans can do with depleted resources, because they built their model before we had 40 years of practice. You moved 4 to 6 million people, she said, in 3 days. In 2 days, 41 hours. She tried to find the right word. Couldn't. Settled for how. We've been routing this for 6 years, he said simply. Every route, every timing window, every resource allocation. The models accounted for it. A pause. Also, there was a lot of motivation. I imagine. Commander Idris. He paused. Sela. What? We want you to come, he said. When you're ready. Whenever you're ready. There's no rush. But we, the Compact, the full population, there's been a vote. We'd like you to come see what we built. She looked at her console. At the inquiry requests she still had to respond to. At the Conclave's position in space relative to a set of coordinates in the outer dark. The Conclave is going to want me available for another 6 months at minimum, she said. We know. We'll be there. Adisa. Yes. The Veth, she said. Once they finish reconciling, once their model updates and they know about the 4 to 6 million, they'll recalculate, he said. We expect so. And a pause. The careful kind. The kind that meant he had already thought about this longer than she had. When the Veth built their model of us, he said slowly, they modeled a humanity that was losing, fragmented, deteriorating. That was accurate. 43 years ago. Their model is 43 years old. Another pause. When they update their model, they're going to encounter something different. Something different how? They're going to encounter a species that spent 40 years quietly building, adapting, routing solutions through problems that should have been fatal, with no outside help, in conditions that their original model classified as incompatible with long-term survival. A pause. And then they're going to encounter a species that, when the moment came, moved 4 to 6 million people in 2 days and 41 hours, without a single detectable signal reaching Veth consensus. She was very quiet. They're going to run the recalculation, he said. And when they're done, I believe, they're going to reach a conclusion that their original model couldn't have generated. Which is, his voice was quiet, not triumphant, just certain. The variable they closed, he said, was never actually resolved. The Conclave did eventually read the documentation. All of it. It took 8 months. During those 8 months, Idris sat through 47 inquiry sessions, answered 12 formal complaints about her conduct at Station Yefkari, and filed exactly one report about it in which she explained, very clearly and very patiently, that she had acted in accordance with her assessment of the situation and was prepared to do so again under similar circumstances. The formal reprimand she received was the mildest the Conclave had ever issued. The Conclave member who drafted the reprimand was Akari, the same species whose station she had sabotaged. Its formal statement, translated from pressure wave communication, read, "We note that the action taken was disproportionate to standard diplomatic procedure. We also note that the action taken achieved an outcome that 43 years of standard diplomatic procedure had not. We are recommending a review of standard diplomatic procedure." Idris framed it. She went to New Meridian 6 months later. The shuttle approach was long. The electromagnetic shadow of the brown dwarf made navigation complicated, but the Compact's guidance systems were precise in a way she'd never experienced before. Someone had spent decades mapping every fold, every current, every anomaly. The approach was like a key sliding into a lock that had been cut to exactly that shape. She came down a mountain, not metaphorically. The city was inside a mountain, just as Adisa had described it, lit by solar relays that caught the brown dwarf's faint warmth and amplified it into something livable, something actually warm, in a way that she had not expected. She had expected cold. She had expected the aesthetic of survival. Instead it was full. Dense with the specific texture of a place where people had been making it work for a very long time and had long since graduated from merely surviving to actually living. Adisa was there. He was taller than she'd expected, and slightly shorter than she'd expected, which was a paradox that resolved itself when she realized she hadn't expected him to be exactly human, and he was exactly human. Not in the generic sense, in the specific sense. He had his grandmother's furious energy in the set of his jaw, she would later learn, and his father's precision in the way he'd built everything around her, and his mother's instinct for where value actually lived. He shook her hand. "Commander Idris," he said. "Adisa," she said, "you should probably call me Sela, given everything." "Sela," he said. He smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes after a very long project is finally, definitively over. "Welcome back." She looked around. At the mountain city, lit from inside. At the people moving through it with the particular ease of people who had built the thing they were moving through. At the children who had never seen Earth, the same as her, but whose parents had given them the same gift her mother had given her. The geography of a place held in memory. The shape of a home that wasn't yet a home, but would be. "Thank you," she said. She meant in about 11 different directions at once. The Veth updated their model. It took 9 months. When the recalculation was complete, the Veth's consensus system issued one communication, their first in 43 years. It was addressed to the Conclave and to the new Meridian Compact jointly. It contained no preamble, no context. Just 3 lines. The classification: Homo sapiens sapiens status resolved. Correction: Homo sapiens sapiens status active. Recommendation: reclassification to threat tier. The Conclave's response took 2 days. Humanity's response took 4 hours. It was short. It did not go through diplomatic channels. It was transmitted on the same frequency, in the same 17 languages that the first hello had used. The first line was, "Thank you for the update." The second line was, "We've been waiting." If you like this narration, hit subscribe and show your love.